Good morning in the United States. Good afternoon and good evening to our listeners in Europe, including in Kiev. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have an exceptional event for you right now. We've got truly distinguished speakers to discuss what's going on with the diplomacy surrounding the Kremlin aggression in Ukraine. And in alphabetical order, we have Steve Biegun, a former Deputy Secretary of State during the Trump administration, as well as an envoy for Korean nuclear talks, and other distinguished positions going back to the Bush administration and Congress before that. We have General Phil Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and a distinguished Air Force career before that. And we have Dan Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State, former Senior Director at the NSC, former Ambassador to Poland, und so weiter, as they say in Germany. And finally, but not least, we have Leslie Shedd, with a distinguished career in Congress, working most recently for Congressman McCall, but now very much on her own, very active in the public space. And we're going to be talking about what we've seen, especially over the last week, in US and Ukrainian and Russian diplomacy regarding the war in Ukraine. And Dan, we'll start with you. By the way, for our listening audience, Dan did a terrific piece in Just Security last week, analyzing the 28-point plan that the United States delivered to Ukraine towards the end of last week. So, Dan, what were the developments of last week, and what is the current status of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine?
The negotiations are hot and on a fast track. They are in far better shape than they were when the U.S. had pushed through its 28-point plan without adequate consultation with allies or the Ukrainians. Much better shape after Geneva. Full credit to Secretary Rubio. The talks are continuing in Abu Dhabi. Army Secretary Driscoll is there with the widely respected head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Budanov, and Russians. There are various press reports that the Ukrainians have agreed to the much revised draft that has not been made public. I would put that agreement in brackets now, because I think some of the biggest issues have yet to be resolved. A settlement takes two big things. One is territory, and President Trump is right. The settlement should be based on the current line of contact. Second item is security for Ukraine, and that needs a lot of work, and I'm going to defer to General Breedlove on this one. That is critical. But I think that the Ukrainians have wisely positioned themselves in a supporting role. They're all behind the Trump initiative, and the Russians are going to have to decide whether they are going to be spoiler and possibly incur Trump's wrath, or whether they will actually try to settle. I think the former, but we shall see.
Okay, Dan, thank you very much. Bill, General Breedlove, some advocates for the Kremlin-friendly, now thankfully defunct 28-point peace plan argued that Ukraine should accept it because Russia is winning this war. You followed the war closely since 2014 when you were in fact SACEUR. What is the situation on the battlefield?
First of all, thanks for having me, and being amongst some of my heroes and mentors is a good thing this morning. Of course, this is what people are talking about out there. This is exactly what the Kremlin and Mr. Putin wants us talking about. Mr. Putin desperately needs to be seen as winning this war, so that those who are less informed in the West will be more open to concessions to the Russian demands. In fact, the war is grinding on in the East. There are, in places, incremental gains and losses by both sides. Russia, most recently, after nearly 18 months, have taken the land around Pokrovsk, but it has come at incredible human cost to the Russian military. And so to describe either side as winning this war right now is foolishness. Basically, both sides are losing. There is a lot to to gain by coming to a peace, but it needs to be a durable peace, an equitable peace that people will respect on all sides. So this war, if left alone, will continue to grind and will slowly move south and west if or until the Western powers decide enough and give Ukraine the aid it needs to defeat the Russians.
Phil, thank you. Leslie, polls show that Republicans, including MAGA Republicans, support Ukraine. We've seen a largest list of Republicans in Congress pushing back against the problematic terms of the 28-point, now defunct peace plan. They include Senators Tillis, Wicker, Cassidy, Rounds, and of course your former boss from the Hill, from the Congress, excuse me, from the House, McCall. We've seen movement from the 28-point plan to now the 19-point plan. Do you think that this concern addressed from Republican circles has played a role in the evolution of this policy, this Trump administration policy initiative?
I'm certain that it has. And, I think it kind of, oftentimes you'll sometimes see the president, the administration put up a trial balloon, right? To kind of see what reaction they get from it, whether people are supportive or not. It really is a true democracy sometimes where people kind of get to weigh in more. I would reiterate your point. There's a new Harris poll out that shows 73% of Republicans are supportive of continuing to send security assistance to Ukraine and of even harsher sanctions that are already in place. So, I think that the more voices in Congress that speak out to show their support for Ukraine and try to guide the policies around that, I'm certain the president is listening. I've said this, before, and I will say it again. I think one of the strongest ways that Congress can make sure that its voice is heard, that its opinion is respected, is to figure out some way to codify whatever security agreements are decided upon if we can get that far. I think that that's crucial, either, having it ratified as a treaty in the Senate or having the US Congress vote on this and codify it. It makes sure that they stay a part of this conversation. But, most importantly, it sends a really powerful message to Putin as well as to our allies that we mean this. We're serious. Republicans and Democrats alike in the executive branch and the legislative branches have joined together to say, if you put a single toe back into Ukraine again, we're coming for you. So I would urge Congress to consider that.
Okay, thank you. Steve, I would welcome your thoughts on that, but also, you've been involved at senior levels in Republican national security policy since your days on the Hill over almost 30 years ago. And of course, you were deputy secretary under President Trump in his first term. So what, in your mind, are American interests in this war? Do they justify the aid we provided to Ukraine since the beginning of the big invasion? And do they justify taking steps now to ensure that Putin does not conquer Ukraine?
Yeah, John, in reference to the polling data that you cite and the observations that Leslie makes regarding how to build, hold, and reflect the support, I have to say I'm not surprised. I have followed these issues across a 40-year career in foreign policy. I worked on the issues in this part of the world, like many of the other representatives on this meeting, throughout that entire period. In 1949, the United States Senate voted to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization by a vote of 82-13. In 1998, the United States Senate voted to enlarge NATO for the first time in the post-Cold War period, 80-19. In April of 2024, the United States Senate voted to provide a $90 billion aid package to support the freedom and sovereignty of the Ukrainian nation by a vote of 80-15. The United States has consistently supported the security of Europe, the independence and the survival of democracy in Europe across different circumstances over the course of the past 80 plus years. So I'm not surprised at all that support sustains, because it goes right to the character of who we are as a people. there's lots of things buried in the polling data, including the fact that the least popular leader in the United States public eyes is Vladimir Putin. He polls a below 13% approval rating with the American public. And so none of this surprises me. This is where we are as a nation. So what are our interests and how can President Trump and his team advance a policy around those interests? Well, first of all, I think there's often a false debate that's introduced by some people in the administration, but also outside as well, that the idea of preserving that historic U.S. commitment to reflect a core national security interest of the United States, the stability and security of Europe, the survival of democracy in Europe, that is a core U.S. national security interest, and that is not incompatible with bringing an end to the war in Ukraine. And that is a false choice, and it's one that's been made just recently by a very senior figure in the Trump administration. One can be for an independent Ukraine and for an end to this war at the same time. That is not incompatible. Now, it's not going to be easy. The issues are very difficult.
Steve, are you still there? Okay. Hopefully we'll have the former Deputy Secretary being back with us in a minute. But why don't we do this? Dan, I'm going to throw you a curveball to take up the space.
Okay.
Some of the opponents of strong American support for Ukraine, distinguished national security professionals, like to point out, as someone did on X just in the last 24 hours, that George Kennan would not like our policy on NATO, the expansion of NATO post the Cold War. But they never point out that George Kennan was opposed to the original creation of NATO. Your thoughts on this?
Exactly right. George Kennan is often trotted out. He was brilliant in his original analysis of our early Cold War strategy. He was the intellectual father of the containment policy. And the long telegram from 1946 from the embassy in Moscow, U.S. Embassy Moscow, is still worth reading. But Kennan's positions were odd. He opposed NATO. He seemed to think that Eastern Europe belonged to the Russians, belonged to their sphere of influence. He opposed U.S. support for solidarity in Poland, which turned out to be spectacularly successful. He had little patience for the democratic dissidents in the communist world. So much as I admire some of George Kennan's work, don't trot him out as an authority because he got a lot of stuff just wrong. Strategically, we were wrong to simply surrender a third of Europe to Moscow's control. That was not inherently stable because Moscow's control means poverty, oppression, corruption, and general misery for those people. That is not a formula for stability. And the overthrow of communism and the breakup of the Russian Empire was profoundly in U.S. interests, not because we want to exploit these regions, but because once they are wealthy, and they are becoming wealthy right now, Americans make a lot more money. Our interests and our values do overlap in that part of the world. You rid Ukraine of Russian domination and the threat of war, and they are likely to prosper as well. The Ukrainian people will overthrow the corruption in their midst. They didn't fight this war to have their own corrupt regime. They fought it to become part of Europe. They're going to be much richer. Americans are going to make a lot of money. So I'm trying to answer your question about American interests because we have them. This is not, support for Ukraine is not luxury. It isn't charity. It's a canny, shrewd appreciation of the American bottom line.
Correct. And it's worth noting that 2 world wars began in Europe. And how many Americans died in those 2 world wars? Okay. Phil, I'm going to throw another curveball to you here too, and then we'll come back to the normal order of questions. If Russia were to win this war, especially if the United States does not provide the support necessary, what would the acquisition of Ukraine mean for Russia's military presence in Europe and our security and NATO security?
So, can you imagine a Black Sea where Russia controls all throughput of the Black Sea? Remember what happened when Russia cut off the grain supplies to Northern Africa and the Middle East, and what happened to pricing and all of the fears of people, having food problems. Think of that. Think of every NATO nation that is a part of the Black Sea coastline being threatened daily by the kind of actions that Russia took first in the Northwest Black Sea before the Ukrainian Navy began to exert itself. So here's the bottom line: the instability of Russia transitioning Ukraine into a forward operating base to project, well, ugly business into Europe. It would not be very conducive to anything we want to do. Like Dan talked about, we think that there is opportunity for economic development and economic growth, and getting better by cooperating in that part of the world. Russia will not bring that to the Black Sea region if they control Ukraine.
Thank you. Leslie, you want to jump in on this too?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'd love to jump in. I 100% agree with exactly what General Breedlove was just saying. And I would add to that drones, right? Ukraine right now is the epicenter of the evolution of drones. We are seeing them do things with drones that nobody else is being able to do. And Ukraine has been a proving ground that the success of drones, and critically counter UAS as well, is going to be crucial in whatever battles we are fighting down the road. So it's not just that we would lose, the strategic position of Ukraine. It's also that we would lose their know-how, their technology. They are now one of the most experienced fighting forces on the planet. So there is a lot that will directly benefit U.S. national security and the U.S. economy if we make sure that Russia does not win.
I would just add to your point that the Ukrainians were the brains behind the Russian rocketry, Russian missiles, working from Dnipro, and we don't want to add those brain power to an aggressive Putin regime. Okay, Steve, we are really happy. I'm relieved to see you back here. You were just going brilliantly. So just to close out the question I gave you, so do you think that our interests there in Europe in this war justify the aid we provided to Ukraine, as well as taking steps now to ensure Putin does not win this war?
Yeah. So,
Steve, we're not getting you clearly. Steve, I think we have to reconnect with you because it's just not coming across. So we'll return. We'll come back. We'll ask our team to get back in touch with you a second time to bring you in. All right. But right now, we're not hearing what you're saying. It's coming off blurred. All right. So then we're going to round two. If you want, because this is a little bit OBE, to address the weaknesses in the draft proposal, the 28 points written last week, but more importantly, what's your assessment of what we know about the new 19-point document?
Well, the 28-point document was internally inconsistent and contained a number of Russian demands that Ukraine would be foolish to accept and we would be foolish to accept. It was weak on security. It was mischievous on the disposition of the Russian immobilized foreign assets, $200+ billion, most of which is in Europe. But it did contain some workable elements. So I think what has happened is the issues in the 28 points that were actually the EU responsibility or NATO responsibility have been pulled, because the US isn't going to negotiate for the EU. I think some of the elements have been strengthened in the new document. And the issue of Ukraine surrendering additional territory to the Russians that the Russians have been unable to conquer, which was just a bad idea, substantively in terms of negotiation. I think that's been dropped. Now, that said, I haven't seen the new document, and I shouldn't. I think it was a mistake by the Trump administration to allow this to get into public. I think Kirill Dmitrov leaked it for mischievous purposes. We lost control of the process. Bad show, but I think we regained it over the weekend in Geneva, and I'd like to see that discipline continue.
Thank you. Okay, General Breedlove, what should the U.S., NATO, and our other European partners do to ensure that this is a durable peace? And what should the U.S. and NATO do about ever more provocative Russian actions in Europe, such as numerous drone and warplane incursions into NATO airspace, as well as sabotage? Most recently, the blowing up of Polish railroad lines about a week ago.
Well, thanks. I'll start with a short vignette attributed to Comrade Lenin, who said that when you approach your enemy, fix your bayonet and press it into his belly. If his belly is soft, continue to push harder and deeper. If his belly is hard, stop and step back and reconsider. So far in this war, no one has shown Mr. Putin a hard belly. The West is dancing around Europe waiting for America to do something, America waiting for Europe to do something. And in the aggregate, we're doing very little. And so to answer your question in a large way, we have to present a hard belly to Mr. Putin. We have to do those things that make Ukraine capable of defeating Russia in Ukraine. The Donbass is Ukraine. Crimea is Ukraine. And we need to deliver the capabilities for Ukraine to increase the cost even yet more on Russia. Their manpower is already struggling. Their economy is already struggling. We need to exacerbate those problems and give Mr. Putin pause to think about stepping back and reconsidering. And I'll just close by saying we make a lot of promises and we are really slow to deliver on those promises. And sometimes after we announce and get the big splash, we actually turn the promises off. There seems to be some disconnect sometimes between the White House and policymakers at the Pentagon. And these things do not lend credibility to our arguments in Europe. What will stop Mr. Putin is real capability and the credibility that we will use it.
Okay, let me just go a little bit farther with an observation to get your comment on it. President Trump likes to say, and I think he has a point, that had he been president in 2022, Putin would not have launched a large invasion of Ukraine. But as he says that, and he repeats it regularly, I look at growing provocations by Russia against NATO countries. And somehow Trump's presence has not prevented that. Do you think that means that at some point the White House will recognize this and present that hard belly you were just describing?
Well, I'm not sure. That is certainly our hope. What we have seen is not only provocations there, but some new provocations in our high north, in our air defense zones around Alaska and the northern part of our country. So Mr. Putin is flexing his muscles. If you watch the interactions of us and Russia across the various peace overtures of the last year or so, every time America goes to Russia, we are rebuffed. And then after we are rebuffed, Russia slams into Ukraine. They are making their point that they are driving this conversation, not we in the West.
Okay, thank you. All right. I think now we're talking about, I think it's Leslie's turn. So the Trump administration has bounced back and forth between finding fault with Russia and then Ukraine for the ongoing war. While Russia is clearly the aggressor, the administration has put more pressure on Ukraine than Russia. How do you explain this? And do you expect Trump's policy will eventually recognize that Putin both initiated the war and has no desire to end it?
So first, I don't think it's fair necessarily to say that they have put more pressure on Ukraine than on Russia. Earlier this year, they put additional sanctions on two of Russia's biggest oil producers. They put tariffs on India for the fact that they are continuing to buy Russian oil. They've kept all of the sanctions in place that were there before, and they're continuing to send weapons to Ukraine.
Fair
So
enough.
yes, I do think that the Trump administration is, by their actions specifically, putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine. I think that the president sees Russia as bluntly the biggest bear in the room, right? They hold more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world. They have a very large standing army, a big economy. They play a significant role. He looks at the world in great power competitions, and Russia, whether we like it or not, is a great power. And because of that, he is going to try to, figure out what he can. He knows that they're not just going to roll over. I mean, I agree. I want to see Russia completely expelled. I think that they should remain a pariah state. You can say all of those things, but nobody has presented me with a way that we can really actually achieve that. I think tomahawks can help. I think we should send them. I think sending more ATACMs should help. I think we need to take the training wheels off, all of those things, but I still don't necessarily know how they are truly going to be able to, dislodge the troops that have just embedded themselves. And bluntly, that happened, the hand that the president was dealt comes from President Biden. We're in this situation now because President Biden refused to send the weapons that Ukraine needed to repel Russians at the beginning of the war when they could have done it. He drug his feet, he hemmed and hawed, and he allowed them to basically entrench themselves and create this stalemate. So I don't necessarily think it's fair to say the president has been tougher on them. As far as what needs to be done to, try to completely erode the confidence the president has in a potential deal, I don't know that that will ever happen. I think that the president values peace. He cares about peace. He wants to figure out a way to resolve this. He's going to keep coming back. I do think, though, my recommendation is I think President Zelensky is smart and that he continues now, he is continuing to try to get to yes in all of these agreements. He is working very hard to try to figure out how to say yes to peace, how to say yes to what the president has offered. I think that that is smart because I bluntly think that there's going to be almost no deal that Putin will agree to. I mean, it's really telling that the 28-point plan that was widely seen as being favorable to Russia, there wasn't any real reaction from Russia on that. So the more that Zelensky can show to the president that he wants peace, he cares about peace, he wants to listen to the president's advice, follow his strategy, I think, and the more that that drives Putin to say no, I think that that will reiterate to President Trump that Putin is, an untrustworthy negotiator. But we'll see. I mean, look, people have underestimated President Trump and his ability to get deals for decades. Nobody thought anything like the Abraham Accords would happen. They have. So I also think we do need to let him do his thing. It's different than what we're used to. It's a little asymmetrical, but it is something that has shown results.
Fair enough. He has an impressive list of peacemaking achievements in the short 9 months he's been back in office, or 10 months he's been back in office. All right. Steve, again, we're delighted to have you back. Hopefully the sound will be working better this time. Two questions for you. Where, in your judgment, is the administration's policy going? And in your judgment, where should it go?
Yeah, so I don't
Terrific.
have anything to add to what Leslie said. I think she described it perfectly. I do give the president absolutely full credit that his objective here is to end the war, to bring peace. And you can see the contortions of how different impulses inside the administration, how they're attempting to reconcile those. But ultimately, the president's commitment is to end this war, and that's a good thing. And we should welcome and embrace that. I think the president also understands that there are certain policies that we could undertake that will be, the proverbial crossing of the Rubicon, that will close off any possibility to end that war, and then shift the United States entirely to a posture where we have to win the war. And that includes some of the weapon systems. That includes some of the policies to put pressure on Putin. But on the other hand, the president is more than capable of increasing that pressure. I think the recent oil sanctions have put pressure on Russia by causing third parties to shy away from Russian energy resources in ways that are perceptible in the energy markets today. I think three things for the future of policy, John, have to be sorted out by the administration. The first is that the reality is Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. Putin doesn't want a negotiation. Putin doesn't want peace. Putin wants Ukraine. And I think that has to be clearly understood, that Putin's objective here is not peace. Putin's objective is war. That doesn't make peace impossible, but it requires other elements on the table besides simply an end to the conflict. It has to avoid the restart of the conflict in the future, for example. Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Ukraine. And the administration's policies are going to eventually have to conform to that reality. The second is there's a misapprehension that it implicates the 28-point agreement that there is a bonanza of business opportunity awaiting the post-conflict period. There is not a major company in the United States of America, not for geopolitical reasons, and to some extent, not even for reputational reasons, but simply as a matter of prudent risk assessment. There's not virtually no companies of any significance in the United States of America who would leap at any opportunities in Russia today, tomorrow, or probably for a generation. It is going to be a long time towards economic normalization, and that assumes that there's some end to the conflict. So to the extent that that drives some dimension of this policy, I think that's Pollyannish. There is no reset here. It's just not going to happen. And the lastly is, and this is a debate that's underpinned the debates inside the administration from the very beginning, is that whether or not our defense of Ukraine comes at the expense of our ability to deter China. And here, I just repeat what I think most of you would fully agree with. This is not a binary choice. This is an all of the above. And in fact, the best China policy for the United States of America is to ensure Russia's defeat in Ukraine, or at least the defeat of Putin's objectives in Ukraine. And so I think those are three issues that the administration is going to have to grapple with. And it's often forgotten, we're just 10 months into President's 48-month term, the President Trump's 48-month term. There's a long time that they're going to have to act on these necessary elements of policy and to execute on them. We're just at the very beginning stages. And by the way, with or without the end of the war, we're due for a very major debate over Russia policy independent of Ukraine in this country.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I think I may ask one or two more questions before we turn to the audience, because we went through these relatively quickly. Leslie, you made the point that you don't think that any specific action would necessarily bring Russia to end the war. I think you're absolutely right. So, but if we have an interest in making sure Putin does not take Ukraine, wouldn't that be reason for us to take steps that may require time to defeat Putin's objectives, but nonetheless require us to devote careful attention and some resources for months, if not a year or two more to come?
I mean, yes, I agree with that. And just, to build off of Steve's comment, to me, it's not even just that they're not mutually exclusive when we're talking about China. I also think a defeated Russia benefits us when we're confronting China. Russia provides China with energy. They provide them with a lot of advanced military technology. So if we can cripple them, or if Ukraine is able to cripple them, that actually directly benefits the US and any type of a future conflict with China. So the answer is, yes, I think that there are things that we can do to cripple Russia. And, I'm not the military expert here. I would defer to General Breedlove for that. But I have yet to see a military plan where even if we send Tomahawks, even if we, send more Patriot batteries and we get the Germans to send more, even if we take the training wheels off on ATACMS, how they are truly going to be able to militarily dislodge the Russians from Ukraine right now. But that being said, there's an asterisk to this, which is I do think that there are things that we can do that can strengthen our hand and that can cripple Russia, where over time, there is a chance that they lose support at home, that they run out of money. So the question then becomes, how long would something like that take? And are we going to be able to sit back and let them continue to kill innocent Ukrainians for how long? 6 months, a year, 4 or 5 years? But if we're looking for something right now that I think could make a difference, I think it'll probably take 6 months or more really for the impact to start to be felt. I would urge passing Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill. It looks like we're starting to see some movement on that in the House as well with the discharge petition. I think that the more pressure that we can put on Russia, the better.
Okay, I'm going to make one comment and then
Yes.
turn to Dan and Phil. And if Steve wants to jump in as well, Steve too. First, as Dan mentioned early, we're not talking about quote unquote dislodging Russia from Ukraine. I would like to do that, but that's not the policy. What we're trying to do, what Trump's trying to do, is achieve a durable peace along the current lines. So that's easier than dislodging Russia from the rest of Ukraine. Point
Agreed.
one. Okay, good. We agree with that. So now, Dan, what do you see as a way to achieve Trump's objective of a durable peace, not a weak peace, which enables Putin to come back for the rest of Ukraine in 10 months or 24 months?
Well, the first is a ceasefire line along the current line of contact. We should not force the Ukrainians to retreat and hand Russia territory it's been unable to take through 3.5, almost 4 years of war. Secondly, the big issue is security for Ukraine. And there we need something that is credible. I've seen the draft. I mean, we've all seen the draft paper, which purports to be the U.S. offer of security guarantees. I'd like to see that fleshed out. I'd like to see Congress backing it. And I'd like Phil Breedlove's assessment of what it would take. But I will defer to Phil, but I'm going to jump into his lane and risk him telling me I'm completely wrong. But I am more confident of the West's ability to help Ukraine defend itself than I was 10 or 15 years ago, because the Ukrainians have largely defended themselves by themselves, with our weapons, with some intelligence, tactical intelligence support. But if you add to all of that Western air power over Ukraine, Western air defense, I think the Ukrainians could make a go of it. So I don't think that security guarantees are improbable, but I think we've got to be there and we've got to mean it, which means, by the way, that this notion of weakening Ukraine's ability to defend itself by limiting the number of weapons it can acquire or limiting the size of its army below what Ukraine actually needs is foolish, because President Trump doesn't want American soldiers to go into Ukraine to fight. Therefore, you have to have the Ukrainians as strong as possible. The point is, these are achievable objectives if we're working with the Europeans and if we mean it. Putin will hate it, which means in the near future, there is going to have to be a moment where Trump stares down Putin. And it's in Trump's interest to show that the critics were wrong, that he isn't Putin's puppet. He's not, simply interested in business deals in Russia. He has an opportunity for vindication, but that opportunity requires Trump to back Ukraine, stare down Putin, and it's achievable. Not easy. It's a rough, narrow, steep path, but that path exists, and that's what I'm focused on.
Then Steve.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want me to go first, John?
Yeah, because the military situation is right now, I think, in play.
So I like to say this, and you laugh every time I do, but I'm in violent agreement with much of what Leslie and Dan just said. Okay, so the bottom line is we have a lot of really bad experience with security guarantees for Ukraine. And the most illustrative one, of course, is Budapest of 94. Russia signed and is now the aggressor in an illegal, immoral, inhumane war. We signed and said we would make assurances, and we have not delivered on those assurances. And so, whatever is next when it comes to security guarantees are going to have to be much more concrete than, say, for instance, Budapest or Minsk or any of the other things that have been run over the top of by Russia. I believe that several things that were said are exactly what's required. It's bigger than America. It has to be America and NATO/EU countries. When Russia looks west into Ukraine, it has to see American flags, NATO flags, and EU flags delivering air power and support and other aid in the rear area of Ukraine that says, Mr. Putin, we are here. You are not going to win this war, period. And that needs to be a loud, proud, public, worldwide pronunciation. The world needs to hear it. The Russian people need to hear it. Putin needs to hear it. We're here. You're not going to win this war. And we move forward. Then I want to be provocative for 1 second. I don't believe we will ever push Russia out of the Donbass in the current political environment. There is no will here to do that. I do, however, believe that it would be much, much easier to use Western air power to make Crimea absolutely uninhabitable for Russia, to drop the bridge and make sure that it never is functional again, and then to cut the land bridge along the western or the southeast portion of Ukraine and make Crimea Ukraine again. Over.
Very interesting. Steve, over to you.
Just however appealing those points are that Phil made, I think we're past that point in this conflict. I think the assertion of U.S. leadership towards a just and lasting peace is really the main lane that we have to be in. And when it comes to that peace, as we've discussed on this call, security, territory, and reconstruction are major issues, not all on the table with Russia, incidentally, but all part of the equation that needs to be struck. My encouragement would be for us to think larger than security guarantees when it comes to Ukraine. I think we need a much more holistic view of a strategy for security in Ukraine, because fending off a future advance of Russian troops on whatever the line of demarcation is one manifestation of security. But having free and fair elections in Kyiv and economic reforms and rule of law across Ukraine are also fundamentally important to Ukraine's security. And so I think about a much more expansive security engagement with Ukraine. Of course, at the centerpiece of it is military. And at the centerpiece of that is the 600,000 plus battle-hardened Ukrainian troops who are there to defend their own country. That should be the central pillar of security in Ukraine, then complemented by development of the Ukrainian defense industry, the continued support of U.S. military assistance, training, and arms, lifting restrictions on how Ukraine uses its arms, Western air defense assets, which could be on the ground, Patriot systems, et cetera, deployed inside Ukraine, but also an air cap provided from Poland by European air forces to keep Ukraine's air secure. Likewise, the sea lanes in the Black Sea and the international waters could be kept open again by European partners, perhaps with U.S. engagement. These are consistent with international law, and they are security. We need an economic plan. The critical minerals agreement is important. The $300 billion in Russian assets transferred to Ukraine is important, but also bilateral and multilateral reconstruction assistance and EU membership, above all, is central to Ukraine's security. And then we need institutional steps, bring Ukraine more deeply into the Three Seas Initiative, and offer Ukraine NATO membership if Russia restarts hostilities. Don't take it off the table permanently. And lastly, but also very important, is for the Ukrainians themselves to secure their country. They have to be devoted to rooting out anti-corruption. What happened in recent weeks is just unacceptable. They have to decentralize power in Ukraine, and they have to move in time towards free and fair elections to have a legitimate, democratically elected government, as they do today, which will underpin a secure Ukraine. That's a much more expansive view than just an Article 5-like guarantee.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. All right, audience questions. We have a question from Donald Fleming. It goes like this. Ukraine appears to have agreed to core elements of a peace deal with quote unquote only minor details left to be worked out with the US. Even if Trump and Zelensky meet and sign a deal or reach an understanding, what are the chances that Russia will accept the revised deal? If Russia refuses and drags its feet, how should the US react? Dan, you want to give this a shot? Maybe others will chime in.
Oh, I'm fairly confident the Russians will reject any reasonable deal. Lavrov has been snarky in public already. So at that point, President Trump has to use his considerable skills and lean on the Russians. We have the ability to increase economic pressure on Russia. We could be doing more to enforce the oil sanctions, which have hit the Russian economy and oil sales, revenue from oil sales. We could work with the Europeans to develop a secure funding stream for arms to Ukraine without any of the limitations so far. And by the way, the Europeans really do need to make a decision on their complicated but doable plan to use the Russian immobilized assets. They can't seem to get it together. They need to, like now. Trump could put, with the Europeans, could put enough pressure on Russia that Putin might have to reconsider. So we have options. And this is going to come down to Trump wanting to achieve a victory in Ukraine, which is achievable. He could do this. He could vindicate his record, prove his critics wrong, support the Ukrainians, get a big win on the board. All of these things seem to be of interest, and it will require staring down Putin in a serious way, and probably sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to this? All right, we have other questions. Okay, I think this one, we'll start with you, Phil. It comes from Kira Giles. What do you think of French President Macron's latest comments that soldiers from France, the UK, or Turkey could be sent to Ukraine as part of the reassurance force on the day peace is signed?
Well, I would applaud such an outcome. And so I would have to say that I would welcome those kind of conversations. As you heard me say earlier, Mr. Putin needs to look to his West and see NATO, European Union, and American flags. And this would be a good first step in that way. Mr. Putin, many have said, not my words, I steal them and use them, that Mr. Putin is not going to stop. He's going to have to be stopped. And so stop doesn't mean that he has to be attacked. But if he comes up against a hard wall, aka a hard belly, in the form of Western forces on the ground, that's a good outcome.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? All right. Steve, I've got one here for you. It's from Mark Wallace. And the question is, could you have Mr. Began further elaborate on the importance of a strong policy towards Russia as it relates to U.S. interests vis-a-vis China?
Yes. So, I don't suffer the misapprehension that we are somehow going to use this diplomacy to create distance between Moscow and Beijing. For Putin, there isn't a choice to be made there. Putin can get the peace that he wants in Ukraine, or the outcome of the conflict he wants in Ukraine. And at the same time, he can sustain his relationship with China. That relationship may in time succumb to other pressures. But I think that's a misperception of somehow an either or there. But for us, as we think about the day after this conflict, we are going to need to think about the role that Russia will play in global affairs and in European security, not just in the course of this war, but in the decades that follow. As one of Phil's successors at NATO frequently says, there's going to be a bloodied, angry Russian military that is going to be really pissed off for a very long time, no matter what the outcome of this war is. And we're just going to have to anticipate that world. It's mobilized its industries to provide for a greater level of military output. There's a lot of, and of course, it remains a significant nuclear power in the world today as well. My view on our approach towards Russia has to be that at the conclusion of this war, we need a strategy that deters Russia first and foremost. There are many failings in the course of events that led to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, only one person is to blame, Vladimir Putin, but one of the failings for sure was a failure of deterrence. Deterrence cannot fail again. We're also going to need a containment strategy for Russia. It's going to take, in my view, a generation or generations before we can find some pathway back to normality. It's going to be in a post-Putin era. We need a long-term policy towards Russia that really involves elements of what we'd previously recognized containment. I just think it's Pollyannish to think that there will be some kind of reset or we'll go back to a new normal.
Thank you. Phil, you want to jump in on this?
Well, again, I completely agree. I would like to add a tangential comment. In my life as in university, as my senior students engage me often on policy and deterrence, they ask me, well, what is our policy towards Taiwan? What is our policy towards North Korea? What is our policy towards Iran? And I often retort by saying, listen, you can Google those. They are well published and they are out there. But in my opinion, those published policies mean absolutely nothing, because to the world, our policy in Taiwan, in North Korea, and Iran is being written every day in Ukraine. The world is watching what we do in Ukraine, and they see that is how America functions with its friends and allies. And so I think we need to be cognizant of that as we deal with the long-term implications of this war. Over.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Erwan Lagadek, which is in the weeds, but relevantly in the weeds. And the question is this: do your guests agree that Kirill Dmitriev most likely leaked the 28-point plan, not as a trial balloon, but to gain time for Russia to continue the war, create new divisions amongst the allies, and force Ukraine to recognize that the U.S. has abandoned it, hence delegitimizing also pro-Western politicians in Ukraine? That's quite an interesting thesis. Leslie, to you.
So my answer is I don't know. but that being said, the Axios reporters behind the original leak have been adamant on social media that it was not from him. Now, is there a chance that he sent it to somebody who sent it to somebody that got it to them? Perhaps, but just to defend Axios and especially Barack Ravid and Dave Lawler, who have been fantastic in covering foreign policy issues, they have been just adamant that it was not him. So for what it's worth.
Okay, that's good. Dan, do you want to jump in on this? I saw your eyes twinkling.
I want to generalize from Leslie's point, with which I am in agreement. That is, there's a kind of sub-discussion going on about who should be mad at whom and who is guilty of laundering a Russian proposal and all this rot. Look, that the Russians want us to chase each other. I am completely uninterested in that. Kirill Dmitriev was playing a game. He saw an opportunity to manipulate Americans, and he did so. So what? Now the administration seems to be in quite a bit better shape. Marco Rubio, I think, did a first-rate job in Geneva getting this back on track. So let's remember what this is about. This is about driving an end to the war that is in America's interest, that leaves Ukraine sovereign and secure. That's what we ought to focus about. I'm not interested in who did what to whom, or the knives are out in court politics. We have an opportunity to have a major success and deal Putin a major blow. That's what we ought to focus on.
Thank you. All right, we have a question. This might be our last, depending upon how quickly we go through it. It's from Alexander Kowalina. How can Ukraine best make its case to the White House in a possible Zelensky meeting with Trump? How can the West best stand up to Russian maximalist demands? Steve, you want to give that a shot?
Sure. I think in two respects, which I think are and have been and will be persuasive to the president. The first is that any agreement needs to end the war, not pause the war. And I think the president is very much in tune with that. He does not want a temporary reprieve. He doesn't want a restart of hostilities, even if he believes that it wouldn't happen on his presidency. The president seeks a permanent end to this war on terms that are durable and will lead to a lasting peace. The second is that the president is interested in an achievement here that is worthy of a great president. Whether that is ratified by the receipt of a Nobel Prize, the acclaim of history, or just the satisfaction of finishing your presidency, having left the world as a better place than that you inherited. Whatever the president's impulse is, the president wants an achievement here that is worthy of the favorable judgment of history. That 28-point agreement that was laid on the table a week ago was not that. Could it be that at the end of this process? Absolutely. Will it be? Remains to be seen. But those are the two things that I believe for President Trump will continue to steer him towards an outcome that I think all of us could be proud of as Americans. Whether we'll get there or not is a stretch. And frankly, whether Putin would ever agree to that anyway, as has been said on this call. Because Putin wants something very different. Putin wants Ukraine.
I see that's a great answer. Let me just make one comment and we'll see if anyone else wants to jump in before we close. I think the logic of your analysis is exactly right, which is why I have never been pessimistic that the Trump team will get to the right place. But I guess the question in that comment is, that's not where Putin wants to go. So do you think the administration will ultimately have the staying power, which is going to take many months to put Putin in that place? And actually, I'll give you a chance to answer that. And then I see Dan wants to jump in, and maybe Leslie and Phil as well.
Yeah. The president is obviously central to this. He's the president of the United States of America, elected by 77 million people to exercise policies that they supported in the election. So, of course, the president is central to this, but he's not the only influence in this. We are a broad and sprawling democracy. We have allies and partners around the world. We have interests that drive our foreign policy that are more lasting than a single presidency and extend from presidential administration to presidential administration. There are many, many other forces at work here, and larger forces at work here, that will steer us continuously towards the right outcome. Again, no guarantee we get there. Presidents in the past have made mistakes, have had policies that failed. There's no guarantees here. But I do have just an inherent confidence in America's democracy and the American people to continue to provide the push that leads us to the right outcome. The reason why Putin's approval rating is below 13% is Americans hate bullies. Putin is the archetype of the type of character that the American people loathe and at times feel compelled to rise up with great sacrifice, putting many other interests in their own personal safety aside to challenge in the world. We don't love doing it. We don't do it as our first choice usually, but that's who we are as an American people.
Good way to end. Dan, 30 seconds.
The issues and lessons of the 20th century are back with us in a contemporary form, and we should draw on those lessons. We can succeed, but we're going to have to stand up for bullies and recognize that American interests are big. We're a big country. We have interests around the world, as Steve said, and it's in our interest that Ukraine succeed.
Leslie, 30 seconds.
Just to go back to your question, I think the original question, the president, I think, is very dedicated to this. I think he cares a lot about it. Like I said, even if it's not necessarily something that we're reading about every day, it's clearly on the back burner for them. It's something they're constantly thinking about and working on. And even if for some reason his interest in this wanes over time, I don't believe that the American people or the American media will let that happen. I think it is going to continue to dominate the conversation until we can get some kind of resolution.
Amen. Phil, final word, 30 seconds.
So I applaud this peace effort. I am hopeful that it will find its way to a durable and an equitable, not a lopsided peace endeavor. And I think a big part of the future of that succeeding is for America to re-engage in the support of Ukraine to some degree. We are now selling stuff to the Europeans to give to Ukraine. The United States of America needs to be involved in providing support for Ukraine.
Making America great again means making sure Putin loses in Ukraine. Thank you all for a very good conversation. And thank you all for listening.